Hello, everyone. It's just a few minutes past the hour, and let's get started. A warm welcome to you from wherever you're joining us. This session of the Vancouver St. Brigid's Festival is Legends and Mythology, Brigid in Place, Mind, and Spirit. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers I will be introducing shortly. But first, I'd like to reflect on our territorial land acknowledgement. As is our practice in British Columbia, we begin by acknowledging the traditional territories in which we live and work. I would like to acknowledge that we are situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. We join today to honor and reflect on the gifts offered by Ireland's matriarchal saint, Brigid. We are lucky that our presentation today falls just about on Imbolg, the traditional first day of spring, also known as St. Brigid's Day. It's a customary time of renewal and emergence on the Celtic calendar. Since 2018, Irish diplomatic missions have organized a series of events on this day, celebrating Irish women and their many forms of creativity. The first St. Brigid's Festival in Vancouver, Canada, took place a year ago on February 1st, 2020. We joined 35 other Irish cultural groups around the world to celebrate Brigid, from Washington to Moscow. This year in Vancouver, and in a virtual setting in which we may gather safely, we are delighted and humbled to welcome guests from around the world for a week-long event featuring a series of inspiring and remarkable speakers. Thank you all for joining us. Our first presenter is a lifelong teller of tales, Philomena Jordan. Living in Vancouver, Canada, Philomena grew up in the west of Ireland in an atmosphere thick with Gaelic culture and tradition. A gifted storyteller, Philomena often embroiders her tales with poetry and spontaneous singing. Philomena has shared her stories at festivals and on television, as well as in schools and seniors' homes. Philomena embodies the Irish storytelling tradition, allowing us all to connect with our Irish roots, whether we were born to Ireland or not. And now, Philomena.
Well, thank you, Cynthia, for that lovely introduction. And I'm so pleased to be part of this Láféile Brigid Festival again this year. Thank you. The power of Brigid, she has been carried down through all of time in the hearts of the Celtic people, especially in Ireland and Scotland. So today, I would like to pay tribute to Brigid in Ireland and share a story of Bride, as she's known in Scotland. So let us sing praise to Brigid, beloved not just in Ireland, but in many lands. Let us all praise her. Brigid, from the word brig, meaning exalted one. And she's also known as Fiery Arrow. She was born at sunrise, and it is said that when she was born, a flame rose up out of her head, right up into the skies. And that flame connected cradle to sun and night to day. And as those who were at her birthing crooned around her in a circle, Brigid broke a plume from that column of fire and she dropped it on the ground in a circle, and it blew up big and red on the hearth. And then she reached up with both her hands, and she took another piece of that flame, and she swallowed it, and it went straight to her heart. And then the goddess, she built up walls and a chimney round that heart that she had created. And in it, she keeps the fires that have served her people forevermore. From the fire in her head came poetry and writing. From the fire in her heart came love and compassion. From the fire in her hands came the power to bend iron. And from the fires in her heart and from her magical wells came the healing teas. And every morning she rose up early and she gathered the plants for those healing teas. And it was she who trained the wise physicians and gave those healing teas their virtue and their power. And so we thank you, Brigid, for these wondrous gifts. And we ask that you rekindle the flame in our spirits this day and this night. Now, in Scotland at this time of year, they celebrate the return of Bride, bringing new life back to the earth. But the story begins with the Cailleach there, the goddess of winter, that crone of wisdom. She holds her seat of power up in Mount Ben Nevis. And every autumn, she strikes the ground with her magic hammer and turns the grass into blades of ice. Now the story goes that the Cailleach kept captive all winter long a beautiful young woman named Bride. Oh, she was jealous of her beauty, and she gave her ragged clothes to wear and made her work down in the kitchens of her palace. Now, the reason the Cailleach kept Bride captive was because her favorite son, Angus, he had fallen in love with Bride. And the Cailleach knew that if they got married, Angus, the ever young, would take his place as the summer king, and Bride would be his queen, and she would reign over the spring. And then the Cailleach's reign would be over. And so Angus, he lived on the Green Isle of the West, that's also known as the Land of Youth. And one day he looked into the Well of Youth and he saw Bride there and he fell in love with her. And sometime later, in a dream, he saw that she was in trouble, that she was weeping in her castle prison. I must go to her at once and set her free, he said to the King of the Green Isle. But the King of the Green Isle discouraged him. There's snow and ice covering the land, Angus. There are storms at sea. And it is the month of Anfuilach, the month of the wolf. And you know the temper of the wolf is uncertain. Therefore, wait a while. Wait until the snow begins to melt and the earth begins to soften and the storms settle at sea. I must go to her at once, said Angus. So I will cast a spell on the land and a spell on the sea. And I will borrow for February 3 days from August. And so he borrowed the 3 days. And the sun came out and shone like pure gold on the mountains and the glens. and the sea lay smooth as silk. And Angus got on his horse and he rode eastwards to Scotland. All that day he rode and all that night. And he reached the Grampian Mountains just as the dawn was breaking. For 3 days he rode up and down the land, but he couldn't find her anywhere. And then one day as he went through a tangled forest, he heard a soft, sad voice singing. She was in the forest near the castle where the Collier had sent her to gather wood for the fire. Well, Angus, he gazed on that lovely young woman that he had only ever seen in his dreams and visions, and he called out her name. And when she looked up and saw him, it was as if the earth began to warm under her feet, and his loving gaze melted all her sorrow. I have seen you in my dreams, said Angus. I have seen you too in my dreams, she said. This is a day of great joy for me. Oh, this will be a day of great joy for all of Scotland and for many lands, said Angus. For on the day that Angus found Bride was the first visit of spring and was known ever afterwards as Bride's Day. The hard earth began to soften and the grass began to push up through the softening soil. Primroses began to grow in the woods and the young leaves began to unfurl on the trees. But oh, when the Collier found out that she was gone, she was furious. And she and her 8 hag servants, they rode out of the mountain to wage war on Angus and Bride. And she called up the winds to help her. First came the wind called the whistle. Oh, it blew loud and shrill and brought down hills of hailstones. It lasted for 3 days and killed the sheep and the newly born lambs upon the moors. And then she brought the sharp-billed wind, and it lasted 9 days, piercing the earth to its core. And finally came the wind that was called the sweeper. It whipped the flowers from their stalks and their leaves, the new leaves from the trees. Well, Angus and Bride were moved with pity for the people whose cattle and horses died for want of food. They drove those hags back to the far north, where they fretted and fumed in a fury. And that night, the Collier remembered. Oh, she remembered the 3 days of winter that had not been used because Angus had borrowed the 3 days from August. These 3 days of winter became spirits of the storm, and the Collier let them loose upon the land, riding on the backs of black hogs. Oh, they brought the snows back again to the newly ploughed fields. The trees were ripped from their roots. The rivers overflowed and many were drowned. These days became known as the 3 hag days. The 3 hog days. Then one bright morning in March, the Collier saw Angus and Bride riding boldly over the hills. And then Bride reached down, and when she touched the ice and it began to melt with her hand, the 8 hags fell into a deep sleep. Oh, the Collier knew her time was done now. She could feel the unmistakable life rising up through the veins of the earth, and it was too strong for her. She flung down her magic hammer, and she was turned into a large grey stone right there on the mountainside, and there she remained till winter returned. Well, Angus and Bride were married, and that very day, Bride touched down, she brought down her hand again on the high rivers and lochs, and the ice that was left melted and was no more. And there was great, great joy in the land. Everywhere she stepped, dandelions sprung up all around her. The linnet sang of bride's beauty, and she became known as the bird of bride. As they rode through the countryside, they could see new changes, new life everywhere. The people had planted their seeds, and they called on bride to grant them a good harvest. Spring has come, chattered the raven, as she flew off to find moss for her nest. And the wild duck rose up from among the reeds and cried out, "Spring has come at last." So, let us celebrate Bride in Scotland, Brigid in Ireland. Oh, the winter can be dark and cutting in its sharpness. But when Brigid's day comes, we know that spring is close at hand, and there is new hope. There is light in the darkness, and that spark of flame brings us a new beginning. Chigam givrujiandav, garulena gera, ahelale brija, garduna rageran, gamalte brija, Now, just before I pass over to Cynthia, I would like to acknowledge the wonderful writer and storyteller, Carolyn McVicker Edwards, from whose book, The Storyteller's Goddess, a lot of the lovely images of Brigid that I shared with you today, they came from there. So thank you. And now I'd like to pass it back to Cynthia.
Philomena, thank you so much. I'd like to introduce Anthony Murphy. Anthony is an author, photographer, tour guide, and journalist based in County Louth, Ireland, just a few miles from the great monuments of Brúnaboinne. Anthony live streams regularly and runs the popular website Mythical Ireland. He has authored 6 books, including the newly republished Island of the Setting Sun, In Search of Ireland's Ancient Astronomers. 2 new books, we understand, are underway. Anthony has a lifelong interest in mythology, archaeology, and alignments of monuments in the Boyne Valley region. In 2018, Anthony co-discovered a previously unknown henge monument near Newgrange Farm in the Boyne Valley. Since then, 22 archaeological monuments have been identified in the area by National Monument Service. He's appeared on programs on the History Channel, National Geographic, the Discovery Channel, Channel 4, and television, radio, and documentary programs in Ireland and abroad. We are very pleased to have Anthony with us today. And Anthony, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and very good afternoon to everyone. It's very much nighttime here in Ireland. Thank you for having me. I'm very privileged and honored to be here. I should warn you that this talk comes with a health warning. It's probably worth an hour and I have to squeeze it into 25 minutes. If I have to skip along very quickly, forgive me. I believe that this talk is being recorded for upload afterwards at some point to YouTube. So maybe at that point, if there's anything you missed, you can slow it down. And please do feel free to ask questions at the end. So I need to share my screen, and this is the bit where I just hope I get the technology right. Okay, I think.
It looks good, Anthony.
Yeah, good. We're good to go. So I'm going to, as I say, breakneck speed now and put the timer on. Okay, this is an investigation that really began over 20 years ago when I was researching the book Island of the Setting Sun in Search of Ireland's Ancient Astronomers. And during the course of that research, myself and my co-author Richard Moore, we stumbled upon Saint Brigid of Faughart, also Brigid in her sort of pre-Christian guise. And so that's really where we begin tonight. So many of you will have heard of St. Brigid's connections with Kildare. And in fact, quite often what happens is that, you know, it doesn't quite get to this kind of argument, but you know, there's a very strong association with Kildare, and people forget that, in fact, Brigid is from Faughart, which is a small townland on a hill north of Dundalk in County Louth, which has stunning views over the surrounding landscape and out across the sea and towards the mountains. Why the fight, if there is a fight? So Brigid was born in Faughart, but she established her monastery in Kildare. And I suppose the question needs to be asked: can we both claim her? You know, don't forget that she's also known as Brigid of Ireland. So it's typical of Ireland that we get so parochial about things, which is, it manifests itself today in such things as Gaelic games and affiliations with your county team, and the rivalry can be quite fierce. Is there some connection, some link between Faughart and Kildare, something that can make us sit up and pay attention to who Brigid really was? And that, of course, is a question that I hope to answer in this short talk. If we take a closer look at Brigid's mythology and the landscape in which she was situated, a stunning and compelling cosmology emerges. And just at this point, to remind you that most of what we know about Brigid is what we would call mythological. If you read Vita, the life of Brigid, or Cogitosis, you'll find that she is a lady who performed many, many miracles. And one would certainly have to frame the whole thing in the guise of mythology rather than in historical narrative. So who is this Brigid that we hear so much about at this time of the year? Well, before Christianity, Brigid was a prehistoric goddess. Now, you see the word there, pagan, in inverted commas in brackets. I don't use the word pagan in my work. I find it a slightly derogatory or pejorative term. I also generally don't use the word Celtic, but there are other reasons for that. Brigid, a major figure of mythology, it could be argued that she actually doesn't get mentioned that much. A goddess of fire, fertility, cattle, crops, and poetry. And one of the reasons that she's very important is she's a daughter of the chief god, Dagda, and wife of Bres. So that kind of puts her up there in the pantheon, as it were. The calendar feast of Imbolc, which we're about to celebrate, has strong connections with Brigid. Just to, I suppose, put you in the picture with regards to the Gregorian calendar, for the sake of convenience, we tend to put a lot of these cross-quarter festivals, as we call them, tied to the first date of the month. But in fact, Imbolc this year is on the 3rd of February, which is tomorrow. And that marks, astronomically, the halfway point in days between the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, and the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, which is in March. And then the other Brigid that we know so much about is an early Christian saint, a major figure of Irish Christianity, alongside St. Patrick and St. Columcille, the three chief saints of Ireland. A saint associated with fire, charity, cattle, crops, and miracles. You can see some tie-ins there with her pre-Christian precursor. A daughter of a pagan Leinster chief, Dubhtach, and Bracha, a slave baptized by St. Patrick. And again, the calendar feast of Imbolc has strong connections with Brigid. A little bit about Imbolc. One of the major festivals of the year, the cross-quarter festivals, those lying between the solstices and the equinoxes. The others being Bealtaine, which is early May. Some people celebrate it on the 1st of May, but it never falls on the 1st of May. Astronomically, it usually falls later. Lunasa, the NASA of Lugh. Lugh held the first Irish Olympic Games at Tailteann, in honor of his foster mother, Tailteann, who had died. And that's the harvest, or the beginning of the harvest festival. And we would generally mark that around the 6th or 7th of August, not the 1st. Samhain, the beginning of winter, or the end of the harvest season, the night upon which the veil between this world and the other world is said to be at its thinnest. Some Neolithic monuments are aligned towards Imbolc and Samhain sunrises. So it stands to reason that if you've got an alignment towards a Samhain sunrise, well, as the sun comes back up the horizon again from winter solstice, the Imbolc sun will also shine in there. Some scholars dispute the origins of this, saying it is a medieval or an Iron Age festival at best. However, I think you'll find, if you look at the photograph there, you'll find that the evidence from the Neolithic sites is persuasive, at least, with regard to an older origin. Imbolc is a time of year when there is a noticeable lengthening of the day. And that's another thing about the cross-quarter festivals, very important about them. The solstices mark the slowest movement of the sun along the horizon. The equinoxes mark the time when the sun is moving at its quickest from day to day. If you watch the sunrise each day at the equinoxes, you'll see it's racing up the horizon at spring equinox and down the horizon at vernal equinox. The cross-quarter days mark the times when the sun is either beginning to slow down or to speed up. And we always, in Ireland here anyway, I'm not sure in Canada and in other parts, but in Ireland, we say this is the time of year when you definitely notice a good old stretch in the evening. It's a time of renewal and growth when the ewes are coming into milk. And we begin to see certain flowers coming into bloom. In Gaelic folklore, Imbolc is the day when the Cailleach, the hag, gathers firewood for what remains of the winter. Some symbols of Brigid, you're all very familiar, no doubt, with the St. Brigid's cross, a simple artifact or emblem fashioned from rushes or straw, which comprises a woven square in the center with 4 radials. There are also 3-armed variants and other variants, indeed other more complex variants. I have 2 on the shelf here behind me. I have the 4-arm and the 3-arm version. 3-arm version was largely confined to the north of Ireland, parts of Ulster, Donegal, Tyrone, Antrim, etc., and was usually actually kept outside in the byre or the barn, not in the house. Made in large numbers on her feast day, it said, to protect the home from fire and evil. And in some parts, it's a curious thing. In some parts of Ireland, the crosses were kept in the roof space. And in other parts, the cross was burned every year and destroyed, and a new one put in its place. So in some parts of Ireland, you could tell how long the family had been in the house by just looking up at the roof and seeing how many Brigid's crosses were there. Fire is a very definite symbol of Brigid. Her sacred fire was inextinguishable, and the holy women kept it burning diligently in Kildare. Beautiful hymn describes Brigid as the shining lamp of Leinster, lighting all the land. Water, many sacred wells and springs are associated with Brigid, including this one at Faughart, and Dolores will know this one very well. Strong healing attributes are associated with water from the sacred wells. Milk, Brigid was born at sunrise and bathed in milk. She was fed from the milk of a white, red-eared cow, and the cows that she milked herself could have filled all the vessels of the whole of Leinster, and the milk overflowed to form a lake. So cattle and cows in connection with the previous, grazing cattle and milking cows associated with the traditions of Brigid. And the goddess, Brigid, is associated with bovine and agricultural fertility. In my mind, that suggests that she may be a Neolithic goddess, but dare we even suggest that? We can never say for sure. Symbols of Brigid, again, birds, particularly the oyster catcher. There's some discussion possibly about the sandpiper, the skylark, birds that make themselves more noticeable to mark the beginning of spring. There is a connection there, possibly with the swan. Cygnus mystery author Andrew Collins makes a connection there. I'm very interested to hear in Philomena's lovely presentation about how Aengus was in love with Bride, his swan maiden. And we have a story here in Brunabonia, Ashlinga Aenguso, in which Aengus is in love with a mystery maiden called Caer, C-A-E-R. And in order to have her love, he finds that she's a changeling and she's a swan every alternate year and a human on the other years. And he has to take the form of a swan to have her love. Some, again, more symbols. Brigid's cloak brought Brigid. When Brigid asked the Leinster chieftain for land upon which to graze her cattle, he offered her only what her cloak would cover, in a sneering kind of fashion. Yes, indeed. But Brigid put her cloak on the ground, and it grew and grew until it covered a great area. This area is known today as the Curragh, and that is in Kildare. The chieftain had no choice but to give her the land. And a connection too between Brigid and the Cailleach, this mysterious deity or female agency from the dim mists of prehistory. She was a goddess known as the Cailleach, which is generally translated hag, but there are lots of different translations for that word. Usually pre-Christian deities, as I said already, are denoted by the word pagan, which is a somewhat pejorative term. The Cailleach was, in fact, a female goddess venerated in many parts of Ireland, including at Slievna Cailleach, Loughcrew, County Meath, where it is said that she was the one responsible for the construction of these cairns, which she dropped the stones of from her large apron as she danced or jumped from hill to hill. And her name is ubiquitous in myth and especially in place names in the landscape. We find her all over the place. A veiled one, or a nun, a Cailleach, a veiled one. More in keeping with the image of St. Brigid is the translation of the Cailleach as nun or veiled woman. Interestingly, Cailleach Dubh was a nun, especially one veiled in black. Cailleach also means a virgin or a celibate woman. In St. Brogan Clone's poem about Brigid, he translates the word Cailleach as virgin. There are two virgins in heaven who will not give me a forgetful protection, Mary and St. Brigid. Under the protection of them both may we remain. And of course, Brigid is known in Ireland as Mura na Nail, which basically means Mary of the Irish. I mentioned already Aengus, the swan god, son of the Virgin, possibly, Machán Og. Og being young, but also a shortened version of Og Van, young woman, which is basically another Irish rendering for a virgin, was offspring of Boann, the white cow goddess whose husband was Dagda. Brigid, in her pagan guise, was a daughter of Dagda and nursed by a white cow with red ears. And Boann, of course, has very strong connections with the Boyne and the Milky Way, which you can explore further on my website, mythicalireland.com, and in my books. Cygnus author Andrew Collins, as I mentioned, connects Brigid with the swan constellation, or Bride, across the water in Britain, in parts of Britain. The fairy swan was among the saints' avian forms, he says. The Milky Way, connected in the Catholic faith with the Virgin Mary, Brigid's equivalent, has for thousands of years been seen as a stream of milk. Collins says, since Bride or Brigid is said to have been nourished by a white cow, personified as a sacred river, Boyne or Boyne, was she associated with the Milky Way on which the celestial swan takes its flight each night? If the answer is yes, then we have in Bride a perfect candidate for the personification of Cygnus as a pagan goddess and Christian saint. And Whitley Stokes, in 3 Irish homilies, said that Brigid was bathed in milk, perhaps a reference to this Milky Way cosmology. St. Patrick, who it has to be said, overshadows Brigid to a large extent. For instance, we have a national holiday on St. Patrick's Day. We don't have a national holiday on St. Brigid's Day, but moves are being made to try and rectify that. And the government this year and over the last few years has been lobbied for a public holiday in St. Brigid's Day. And a poll in one, I just found this out today, a poll in one of our national news websites of people found that 70% of Irish people are in favour of making St. Brigid's Day a national holiday. So Patrick arrived at Slane. I'm just conscious of the time. What have I got left? About 8 minutes. Okay, got to speed up. St. Patrick arrived at Slane in 433 AD, just after spring equinox, and lit the Paschal fire there at dusk, announcing Christianity to Ireland. In doing so, he defied the laws of the High King, which said that the sacred fire must first be lit by the king at Tara. And that king was Lera, who ordered that the guilty party suffer death according to the law. And I always say that the fact that there was a sacred Easter fire before Patrick arrived tells us that such customs existed prior to the arrival of Christianity in Ireland. In other words, there was an Easter before the Christian Easter. Early on in our research, Richard Moore and I found the hills of Tara and Slane formed an alignment with Mount Oriel near Cullen in County Louth, and there's a prehistoric barrow cluster on Oriel. We soon discovered this alignment crossed some ancient sites on a hill called Railtog, which means star. This hill marks the location of winter solstice sunrise viewed from the famous monument of Newgrange. Was there a cosmology hidden in the story of St. Patrick's Paschal fire? We thought there might be, and Richard always asked the question, why was St. Patrick apparently drawing the king's eyes towards Slane and Oriel and away from Tara, where the centre of power and politics was? Of course, it could be argued that the reason he chose Slane was because it overlooked the very overtly pagan cemetery of Brú-na-Bóinne and also had eyes towards Tara. Using modern astronomical software, we can go back in time and see what was happening in the sky in the past. This is Stellarium, which is a free program downloadable from the internet. And a fascinating cosmology reveals itself when we wind the clock back to dusk on March 26th, 433 AD, just as Patrick was lighting the Paschal fire in the Hill of Slane. Now, I should just very quickly say that the histories differ in the date of his arrival. Some say it was 432 AD and some 433. That does not matter to what unfolds in the sky because it's the same on both occasions. The astronomy reveals intriguing symbolism underlining the story. And that is that at the moment Patrick is lighting the fire on the Hill of Slane, the cross-shaped constellation of Cygnus, that's the swan, the one we know today as the swan, is rising over Slane and Oriel. The imagery is stark. Patrick brings Christianity to Ireland with the cross rising along the axis of the Tara-Slane alignment, the fire at its centre. The cross has been a sacred symbol in Ireland since the earliest times. The cruciform shape is inherent in the design of passage mounds, such as Newgrange, Nowth and Douth, which are over 5,000 years old. Patrick was merely supplanting the old symbolic, he was supplanting the old with the new, basically. We've outlined the cosmic significance of lighting the Paschal fire, but what relevance does this have to Brigid, you might ask? Well, if we extend this line towards the north, can anyone imagine where it leads us to? And in fact, we find it leads us directly to Faughart, stretching 34 miles in distance and accurately passing over some of the most distinguished sites of Irish history and prehistory, notably Tara and Slane. And all the way precisely to the well that I showed you a picture of a while back, the well of St. Brigid in Faughart Graveyard. And the alignment passes directly through the barrow cluster at Oriel, directly over the mound at Slane, which is said to be the burial place of the Fir Bullock King Sláine, directly through a moated site at Railtog, and there are other monuments along the route. And even at Bow Park, again, the accuracy is astonishing. Another interesting point is the fact that the Tara-Faughart alignment passes over the bridge over the river in Dundalk, probably an ancient fording point where the gravel ridge road crossed the Castletown River. Couldn't get any more astonishing than that, right? What if we trace the line further south beyond Tara? Where do you imagine that might take us? Here's here's a view looking from Faughart back towards the south along those string of monuments. And yes, indeed, it brings us back to Kildare. What could possibly be at the end of this line? Well, it's the Curragh Plain, which Brigid was granted by the Leinster chief through the miracle of her cloak. yes, this is very important to the story, because if that hadn't happened, I don't think Brigid would have established her monastery at Kildare town, which lies just along the west of the Curragh in Kildare. So the alignment basically connects the two major sites associated with Brigid, her birthplace at Faughart and the Curragh, alongside which she established her monastery. It should be noted also that if this alignment was intentional and not a complete accident of you know, a synchronous coincidence, then it has to have been set down in prehistory, because many of the sites are pre-Christian and prehistoric. Another synchronicity is very interesting. Around the time I discovered the alignment, I found something astonishing. That was that the alignment crosses Bridge Street in Dundalk, where my grandmother lived as a child until she got married and moved to Drogheda. Can you imagine what my grandmother's name was? That's right, Brigid. And can you guess where my grandmother Brigid was born originally before moving to Dundalk? That's right, Kildare. You couldn't make it up. And there's her house, the yellow one, still standing in Dundalk to this day. So it seems that the story of the Christian story might have been sort of cosmically inspired, and the cross-shaped constellation is very interesting. There's more, because Cygnus, the constellation, was rising in the far north since the Stone Age and beyond, and had probably been long venerated as a sacred constellation. The rising position puts the cross in a diagonal position. Is that possibly inspired? What inspired the St. Brigid's cross? Again, that's speculation on my part. And so just to conclude, observation, there's a 65-mile or 104-kilometre alignment connecting the Curragh and Faughart, passing through Slane, Tara, Oriel and other sites. Was this intentional? Were there other alignments? Is it prehistoric or historic? Should also say that Dolores found out that historically there was an old pilgrim route. That was the work of a historian in Dundalk. That he found out there was actually a pilgrim route connecting Faughart with Kildare. Brigid has strong associations with both. Does the alignment help us understand why this is? We must assume the alignment is prehistoric. If so, was Brigid also prehistoric? Some of Brigid's symbolism points to a cosmic inspiration, significantly the constellation Cygnus. Does this help us understand the deeper origin and significance of Brigid? Why was Cygnus so venerated in prehistory? And the Tara Slane Faughart alignment has a strong connection also with Patrick and the Paschal fire. Does this, through cosmic symbolism, help explain what was happening when Patrick lit the fire? And I should say that there's a significant Patrick alignment running east to west across Ireland, and the Patrick and Brigid alignments converge on that mound at Slane, probably where the fire was lit, somewhere in its vicinity. Fire and water meet, because the Brigid's well, of course, at Faughart, it marks the water, and the fire site is at Kildare. It is fitting, therefore, that in modern times the sacred flame from Kildare and the healing water from Faughart have been brought together in a ceremony which acknowledges that both places have a very powerful and beautiful association with Brigid, and the ceremony represents healing. We won't fight over Brigid, we will just celebrate her. Thank you very much. And there are links to my websites and my social media. And I'll pass it back over to Cynthia. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I am so sorry that you had to go so quickly, but that's amazing. Our next speaker is Dolores Whelan. She's a teacher, author, and spiritual guide working within the Celtic spiritual and mythological tradition for the past 25 years. She advocates the reemergence of Celtic spirituality, the protection of sacred Celtic landscapes, and the celebration of ancient Celtic traditions. Dolores has contributed to publications and authored 2 books, including Ever Ancient, Ever New, Celtic Spirituality in the 21st Century. Dolores' exploration of the Celtic year led to a CD and her co-development of a perpetual Celtic calendar. Dolores is a regular speaker at events celebrating Irish and Celtic cultures in Ireland, and on conference, radio, and television programs around the globe. To you, Dolores.
Hi, it's just so lovely to be here, and it's so lovely to be speaking about Brigid. My house is in a direct alignment with the Hill of Faughart. I didn't know that when I moved here. I didn't know it until after I put in an extra ceiling and was able to see, oh my God, my house is in a direct alignment with Faughart. But of course, there are no accidents. I am not from this area. I grew up in Cavan. I went to school in Navan. I never heard of Brigid. It wasn't something that the school I went to was into. And so I found myself living in Dundalk. I came for a year and I'm still here a long, long time later. But I remember going to Faughard around 1991, I think it was. And something happened there. And so I became fascinated with Brigid and over many, many years have become fascinated with Brigid. And I, I have always been interested in spirituality. And interestingly speaking, in Canada, because when I was in Canada over 30 years ago, I met Matthew Fox, who was teaching a course in Edmonton. And I went to the course and I was blown away by it. And I found myself going and studying with him in California. When I came back to Ireland, I also began to study with a wonderful teacher on Father Sean O'Din, who was he was a monk in Glenstone Abbey and an absolute amazing, amazing resource of wisdom from our ancient past. And he took me under his wing and he really mentored me and he was a tremendous support to me. And I began to ask questions. So I wondered about the land and I was most wondering about what kind of ancient spiritual traditions did we have. And it became obvious to me that actually I wasn't connected with the ancient spirituality of Ireland because most of the connection was with Christianity in whatever form it was in. So I started to kind of go back in and I find myself going to Faughard quite a lot. And as Anthony said, Faughard is on a hill. It's a magnificent view. I was there yesterday, and there was loads of water in the well. Anthony, there isn't always water there, but there was loads of water there yesterday. And Faughard is a beautiful sacred place. And I ask myself then, what makes a place sacred? And it's a beautiful thing in the Irish landscape. We talk about the animi loci, or the places of soul. And those places of soul are places where the energy is slightly more intense, the spiritual energy or the unseen energy is more intense and therefore more available for people to experience it. The interesting thing is that it's as we come to a place, any place, but a sacred place in particular, if we come with an open heart and if we come with a willingness to experience something, then we experience it. And there's a reciprocity between us coming there and the energy that's already there. When I come to a sacred place like Faughard or Kildare or Tara or Newgrange, with that openness to experience that spiritual energy, then I add to that energy and that energy feeds me. And it took me a long time to get that because I spent a lot of my time in my head. I worked in science and all that kind of stuff. But as I began to drop from my head into my heart and into my body, I began to experience the energies in the different places. And when I go to Faughard, and I was there yesterday, what I feel there is a tremendous sense of peace. And I feel a sense of the nurturing of Brigid. So who was Brigid anyway? So we don't really know who she was. As Anthony mentioned, she was born. First of all, there are so many different versions of Brigid, and as Anthony alluded to, she was a goddess way back in the megalithic times. She was a goddess in other times, and in the time of early Christianity in Ireland, she was born, it is said, at Faughard. And again, one of the things about Brigid that is intriguing to me is that she is a threshold person. And in her birth, she was born on a threshold of the door of the house, but she was also in between. Her mother was a slave, a Christian slave. Her father was a pagan chieftain. So she was here in between two different cultures. And all along her life, Brigid has held the space of boundaries and how to navigate the space between. It is said that she was able to hold both sides of an argument very clearly and therefore was always involved in resolving conflict, because she had developed the capacity to not be attached to an outcome. Now, Anthony mentioned in his talk about the virginal aspect of Brigid, and I'm very interested in that concept of virgin, because I grew up with very strong Catholic education, and virgin was very, very important. And but it was when you read about Brigid and other people who were virgins, like the Vestal virgins in Rome, virginity was not about refraining from sexual activity, although that might have been part of it. Virginity was about a person who was defined unto themselves, and therefore was free in that deep sense of being able to act from a place of inner integrity. When I think about Brigid, I think about the qualities she had. And the qualities that Brigid had are very, very important. First of all, she was very clear about her spiritual destiny. She was very clear about the road that she would travel. So when her father wanted her to marry a suitable man, she said no. And she wasn't doing it to be against her father. She was doing it because it wasn't aligned with her spiritual destiny. So in order to do that as a young woman, she had to be strong, she had to be clear, and she had to know who she was. And she had to be able to stand in that place of her own inner authority. And the word for that's used a lot for that now in the present day is sovereignty. She had a huge alignment with being a sovereign human being. And a sovereign human being is somebody who is able to navigate the world from that place of inner wisdom. Brigid, when we hear of Brigid and at Imbolc, we hear about this Brigid of the sunrise, rising in the springtime, healing all the land. But what point I want to make, because Brigid is in the Christian form, she's seen as a saint, but in her pre-Christian embodiment, she was a goddess. And all of the goddesses in most countries had the form of triple goddesses. And the two that are really important in this conversation are the Cailleach, which Anthony spoke about, and which Philomena told so beautifully, and the Cailleach and the young maiden. And what's really important to understand is the young maiden is the one who comes out with her guns blazing, and she blazes through the land. She, the red-eared white cow, nourishing the people, nourished now the hunger so longing in our land. Now, and so we go into this, so she blazes through the thing, she lights the land, she awakens the land, she awakens the Nyarth, which is the life force. And in doing so, she becomes this catalyst for change and this catalyst for new beginnings and new possibilities. But the question that's really important to me is, where did she get that power from? And this is where the polarity between herself and the Cailleach comes into play. The Cailleach spent the time in the wintertime. The Cailleach is the energy of the wise. Sometimes the Cailleach is portrayed as a very nasty person or a nasty energy, but actually I don't see it as that. I see her as the strict and the challenging mother goddess who insists that we go into the darkness, quieten down, and that we learn how to be with ourselves. And we sink down into the earth in the wintertime in the Northern Hemisphere, and we go right down into those quiet places where we can find the wisdom and we can nurture that wisdom in ourselves. And then when we're filled with that wisdom, we can come back out in the springtime with new beginnings and new energy and new ideas. I think the world we live in right now in Western culture is a world that does not like winter, does not like stillness, does not like the quietness that demands inner reflection. We want to be active all the time. And one of the things I learned from studying the Celtic calendar is that there is no Bealtaine, which is at the beginning of summer, without Samhain. And we don't understand that. We live in a culture that desperately wants to live in the summertime, in the bright time, all of the time. And that isn't possible, nor is it in any way healthy, because it's only by going down into those quiet places that we get the wisdom, and we get the wisdom, and we get the capacity to move forward. I'd like to share a poem with you called Brigid's Well, which was written by Richard Carney, who I think used to be a professor of philosophy in Cork University. I will rest now at the bottom of Brigid's Well. I will follow the crow's way, footprint by footprint in the mud down here. I won't come up until I'm calmed down and the earth dries beneath me, and I have paced the caked ground until smooth all over. It can echo a deeper voice, mirror a longer shadow. Then the fire may come again, beneath me this time, rising beyond me. No narcissistic flinted spark behind closed eyes, but a burning bush, a fire that always burns away, but is never burnt out. And what that poem tells me is that if we want to be effective agents of change, we have to balance our activity in the world with our reflectiveness. We have to, I suppose, refrain from becoming addicted to activity, which is what is so valued in our culture. Because when we do that, A, we get burned out, but secondly, we actually become less effective. We become less authentic. And we see that all the time in the world. There's a fear of stepping off the treadmill in case we lose our place. And you never lose your place when you're living in balance with the world. Brigid is emerging hugely all over the world, hugely in Ireland. This year, I could not believe the amount of events that were on television, on radio, in every place all over the country. Millions, I mean, hundreds of events were celebrating Brigid. And it doesn't matter which particular aspect of Brigid they're celebrating, because what they're celebrating is the return of feminine energy. And the feminine energy which Brigid holds is a tremendously important aspect of what we as a society are missing. There is a huge imbalance in our society in that we do not value deeply the feminine wisdom. And if we did value it, and if we brought it into conversation with the masculine energy, we would have a much more healthy society. And we wouldn't be in the catastrophic ecological situations that we are in. Brigid was somebody who was totally aligned heaven to earth. And that's what I love about her. She was deeply spiritual, but she was deeply earthy. And she loved to drink beer as well. Brendan Connelly wrote a beautiful poem about her, about the lake of beer. I can't recall it. But the thing is that she was a real human being, aligned heaven to earth. And in a way, isn't that what we're trying to get to? That we live our lives here on earth, but with a conscious connection to that other dimension of reality. And then when we have that conscious connection with that other aspects of reality, we have a greater wisdom, we have greater resources on which to draw, so that we can become effective agents of transformation. Because in a way, that's what we need to be, because that's what Brigid was. And one of the things that I say about Brigid is that Brigid was and is an archetypal energy. And what I really am interested in, I love the stories of Brigid, and they're so amazing, because that's where we get all our information. Because as Anthony said, there's not a huge amount of historical evidence of the various things, but the stories. And that's because in Ireland, we tell stories. My father couldn't give you directions to go down the street without telling you two stories, So it's like, because that's an oral tradition, and we are storytellers. And so when we look at Brigid, and we look at what she stood for and what she embodied, and we look at what's missing in our world, we can see that in fact, we need to embody that energy of Brigid hugely in whatever way we can. And it's interesting, one of the things I became aware of recently was that I am a wayshower. I never knew how to describe what I do, but a wayshower. And so I have sometimes a capacity to not consciously see, but at some level of my being, I see what's coming down the track. Now, I don't know that. And so I begin doing something that's away on the edge. And it's hard, and people don't know what you're talking about, and so on and so forth. But eventually people catch up with you. And Evan Boland, the wonderful Irish poet, said, and I never forgot this, she said, it's a foolish center that ignores the margins, and it's the role of the margins to influence and redefine the center. And so we are at this stage now. And Ireland, I believe, has a hugely important role to play, not because we're better or worse than anybody else, but because we have a very strong link with our mythological and with our spiritual traditions. Not religious, deep spirituality resides in Ireland and in many places, but we have a connection to it. And I see one of the great things I like to share is that I was reintroduced to the mystery of the Celtic lands by a Native American Indian woman called Dee Annie Wahoo, when we myself and a group of people were asked to bring her around the sacred places. And it was an extraordinary, because I didn't actually know that we had another, an older and more mythological and ancient spiritual path. But we had, and we have. And I just want to just check out something here. Yes. Okay. Yes, I think it's interesting that Brigid is in Faughard, associated with Faughard at Imbolc, because Faughard is on the northeast of the country and Imbolc is on the northeast of the Celtic calendar. And Imbolc is a time of transition. It's a transition from the depth of winter into the possibility of spring. It's not quite spring, but we're getting there. It is the first day of spring, but we still know there may be harsh times to come. But at that time of Imbolc, there's a kind of a fragility in that there is the potential for new life, but we can't be sure of it. We still have harshness to come. And as Philomena said in the story, we can still get our crops ruined and the storms can come back up and all of that. But there's a consciousness that we are actually on a transition at this time. And in fact, I think we don't have any choice but to be in transition, because we cannot continue the way we were living. We're in the middle of a pandemic, we're in the middle of a major crisis, and that is only the most recent of the many crises we've had over the last 20 or 30 years. And all of those crises emerge from the same root cause. We have lost our connection with the earth, our mother. We have lost our alignment with ourselves as part of the earth community. We don't own the earth. We're simply one of the inhabitants, and we have lost that connection. Brigid was hugely connection with the rhythm of the earth and with her knowledge that we needed to live in rhythm with how the earth unfolds. So we know how to live in the different seasons, but in our modern culture, we've tried to override that. We want to always live between Bealtaine and Samhain. We want to be always in that summer, bright time, sunshine, and out doing stuff. But we can't do that. We can't do that without a huge cost. We're afraid of darkness. We're afraid of stillness. But Brigid teaches us that in those places of stillness and quietness, she will speak to us. She will speak to us the wisdom of the wise woman that she was, because she's now emerging in this 21st century She past her Celtic Christian saint, she's now emerging as a wise teacher to men and women who have open hearts and open hearts for change, and who know that the way we are living is simply not sustainable. So my sense is that we are in an Imbolc time, and how we progress from now is both our choice and our responsibility. And if we wish to be agents of transformation like Brigid was, we must embody the qualities that she had. And many of her qualities were courageous, her courage, her self-mindedness, her generosity, her kindness, her absolute trust in the divine. And there's so many beautiful stories about her giving away food from her father's house. And then when they sat down for dinner, it came back. And there's a lovely story where she gave away, this lady gave her this basket of beautiful apples that she had polished and everything. And Brigid graciously accepted them and thanked her. And as soon as the lady went, this poor family came, and Brigid immediately gave the apples to the family. And the lady was quite horrified, and she said, "But those were for you, Brigid." And Brigid said, "What's mine is theirs." And there's this sense of hospitality and of community and of connectedness. And those are the things which our very modern society have sidelined. They have, it's very much, we have an expression in Ireland, "May fain as a me first." But you know what? We have to go back and understand, like the beautiful Irish expression is our Scott Acela and Mario Nadini. We live in the crook of each other's arms. And Neil Nyartka Curla Kayla. We only are strong when we come together. And we've seen that, I'm sure, in Canada and in Ireland during the pandemic. We have seen how people have really been amazing and done way past what would be called the call of duty in order to be part of creating a support for the crisis that we were in. The word crisis has two meanings: danger and opportunity. And my question is, most people, when they hear the word crisis, they think of what's going to happen wrong. But actually, what if the crisis is an opportunity into standstill, which the pandemic has been, and to allow us to ask different questions, deeper questions. And in asking those deeper questions, again, tapping into an old Irish tradition, which is the door to knowledge is questioning. And if we want to question, we have to ask the right questions. Because if we don't ask the right questions, we don't get the right answers. And at the moment, the questions we need to ask are, how can I become an agent of transformation like Brigid was in our time? Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores. I so appreciate your time and your comments. Thank you, Philomena. Thank you, Anthony. We have we have some time left, so I thought we would look at some questions. We've gotten quite a few and many comments. So let me just turn to those and we'll ask our panelists. Okay. Starting from the top here, Philomena, many good comments about your presentation. Thank you so much. Anthony, and also any of you can answer any of these. This one I think has to do with Anthony's presentation. It says, apropos cows, is there any connection to cow-eyed Hera or Ceres Demeter as far as agriculture is concerned?
A very quick answer to that is I don't know, because I haven't done the comparative work, but quite possibly because we see cows in mythology in Indo-European myth. But I can't. I'm sorry that I can't answer specifically. I've spent 22 years of my life embedded in Irish mythology, and after 22 years of reading, I just realised that in fact, I have only begun to scratch the surface of it. So European stuff will have to wait.
Very good, very good. Okay, Dolores, I think this also actually perhaps Anthony and Dolores. Diane asks, I've researched about spiritual virginity as a state being able to be returned to through bathing in sacred pools, which brings in the water, the pools, the wells. So it's a comment on retaining or obtaining spiritual virginity through water. Any comments?
The waters around here are pretty cold at the moment. I'm sure that I know that certainly the whole water for purification has always been both water and fire for purification. I'm not familiar with the idea that water was particularly associated with virginity.
No, I can't help any further with that one either. You know.
Okay.
No.
Okay. All right. They're good ideas, though. Dolores, I wonder if you, just a shout out, could you mention the name of the author of the poem that you recite?
Yes, I can send it to you. Yeah, it's Richard Kearney, Kearney, but I can email it to you for a resource.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, we can post that later. There's been several questions about that author. Okay, let's see. Several comments about appreciation for both presentations. Let's see. Anthony, here's a question. I would like to read a book about Celts and the possible pan-European civilization and culture. Danny writes, does it exist or do I need to wait for you to write it?
There are dozens of books that deal with both Celtic mythology and the notion of the Celts as being a sort of an Iron Age civilization. So it depends on whether your interest is archaeological or mythological. But I mean, if you go on to Google or Amazon and just search for either Celtic mythology or Celtic history, you will see that there are dozens of titles. I will recommend one in terms of the myth, and that is the wonderfully brilliant Oxford Dictionary of Celtic Mythology by James McKillop, which is a fabulous introduction. Celtic mythology, you know, the unfortunate thing is that in Britain, because of the influence of the Romans, among other things, it's only really in the periphery of Britain, in Scotland, for instance, and Philomena gave us a taste of that earlier, and indeed in Wales. But like 90% of what you'll read in any book about Celtic mythology is actually Irish mythology. And I think that was one of the reasons that I don't generally mention the term Celtic in my work. Mm-hmm. I'm largely dealing specifically with Irish mythology. The word Celtic is sometimes used on the cover of a book to help with sales, and that's the only reason. There's an archaeology book with Celtic in the title, and if you read the introduction of it, the archaeologist says, I didn't want to call it Celtic anything, but the publisher said it would sell more copies.
Yeah, well, this is it, yeah.
Okay, and actually it's interesting, one of the questions I'm trying to see it is, so thank you for explaining that, Anthony, because someone had asked why you did not like to use the word Celtic. So you just took care of that. Let's see. Here we go. Diane mentions, just as a point, Diane mentions old stories of Celtic and Dakota nations sent down to an island which was destroyed, people fleeing over the waters east and west. So that would be perhaps a primitive creation myth or something of that nature. Let's see. Philomena, question for you. Just one, Gemma mentions, just wondering what book Philomena referenced for the story she told. Could you give that a shout out again?
Sure. It's Carolyn MacVicar Edwards, The Storyteller's Goddess. Okay.
Thank you. And an attendee mentions Dolores is so right about the word crisis, danger and opportunity. Every opportunity involves risk. Be an agent of transformation. I think that's a wonderful reflection. Here's a question. From Anthony Madden? What role did Brigid play in the Book of Kildare? Anyone?
I don't know.
I'm not sure that there's a specific answer to that. The Book of Kildare was written in the scriptorium of the monastery at Kildare, which was founded by Brigid. Remember, Brigid is 5th to 6th century AD. Most of what survives in terms of written manuscripts post dates the era in which the major saints actually lived. However, I'm not an expert on the subject, so I may not be able to give a proper answer. So I apologize if that's the case.
No, wonderful. I appreciate the comment. Jane asks Dolores, will you please tell us again the old saying, we live in each other's arms? Can you touch on that again?
Yeah, we live in the crook of each other's arms, on the crook. I was just typing it in here. We live in the crook of each other's arms. Okay. Yeah. Send privately. Okay. Yeah.
And then another comment from Mary. I think, Dolores, could you speak a little bit more on the definition of Brigid as a threshold person? And thanks to all three for this presentation. And Mary mentions it's lovely. I wonder if you could just touch base a bit more, maybe expand a little bit on the threshold idea. It seems to be quite.
Yeah, well, I think that, I suppose we all have different, I mean, to me, that's one of the things I focus on because I find it a really important, you see, we can talk about the stories and they're lovely to listen to and they teach us about the qualities of her. But one of the questions that I have, and a very dear friend of mine who died last year, and he was a wonderful priest and a wonderful Brigid man. And he said one day at an event, and I was really taken by it, and it was, what if the archetypal energies of Brigid are inside in you and me, unopened and unlived? To me, that was a wonderful question. And he asked that question, I think it was in 2011, and I'm still working with that question. And so to go back, why do I say she was a threshold person? Because she had to go in there and she had to find the qualities within herself that would allow her to step outside of the comfort of the group and step outside so that she could make a way forward. She could go forward into where she knew she was being guided rather than staying with the crowd. And so in order to do that, you have to step out of your comfort zone. There's, and you step outside of your comfort zone. And as I said, her time is Imbolc, and that is a big threshold time. And it's the coming into new life, new possibilities, new ways to live. And that, of course, is exactly why we need her energy so much now. And as I said in the presentation, what's desperately missing in men and women is the valuing of the deep feminine energy, which is the energy of waiting, of active waiting, of reciprocity. It's the energy of inward focus. It's the energy of allowing as opposed to pushing. And this is huge in our society. And I have to say, if there was one thing that I've learned in the last year, is that I'm allowing more than pushing. And I was saying that to one of my friends. It was a gift I got from the lockdowns and the pandemic, was that I'm allowing. So that allowing, when we're pushing, it's exhausting. But it's also us trying to be in control. When we look at Brigid, and this is a really important story, she was so aligned with the divinity and with the earth, that she knew that if she stayed in that alignment, she could manifest anything. She was a very powerful manifester. And how did she manifest? By tapping into that energy of alignment. And when she did that, things flowed for her. But there's a lovely story. I mean, that story about the king in Leinster. He didn't give her what she wanted first, but then she never gave up. She always found another way, and she didn't say, "Oh God, that prayer didn't work." She didn't say that. She said, "Okay, maybe I need to ask this in a different way." And I find sometimes I start a project and I expect it to go one way and it doesn't, and I get disheartened. But I think what I've learned is, when it doesn't go in that way, and God, it's taken me a long time to learn this. I was a pretty slow learner, because I would have been, like so many people of my generation, quite strong-willed and thought I knew the best way. But when I look at how many people, not only Brigid, who are really aligned heaven to earth, their lives flow. And that's what we want. We want to learn how to flow with life, not fight against it. I hope that answers a long-winded answer, so I'm sorry.
Oh, Dolores, that was wonderful. That was wonderful. Also, Dolores, one quick question here. Joyce asks, please repeat the native name. You mentioned the name of a woman.
Of the Native American Indian lady.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, she was Deannie Wahoo. She lives in Vermont, I think.
Okay.
Is she?
Good.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. Yeah, and she's also a Buddhist scholar. It was, yeah.
Oh. Okay, let's see. Now let me scroll down here. Here's just a comment from Amy. She indicates, speaking of spiritual virginity, I think of the concept of and I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing it, mikvah, Mikvah, in the Jewish faith, which may be worth researching, which I thought was a good comment. Anyone, and Anthony, maybe this is in your realm. Was Patrick that knowledgeable? Monica asks, was Patrick that knowledgeable, or did he have a druid mentor?
Patrick actually converted several druids. He made bishops of them, in fact. He arrived at Inverculpa, which I think is very, very important, because that's the same place that Amergin, the poet and bard and spiritual figurehead of the Milesians, landed when they came to take Ireland from the Tuatha De Danann. So we see very major changes, shifts in power, in political and spiritual power, taking place at the mouth of the Boyne. Patrick's story is full of politics. At the end of the day, I think, as I said, I alluded to in the talk, one of the reasons certainly that he chose Slane for the Paschal Fire was because he was clever. He's got eyes down on Newgrange, Nouth and Douth, the heart of De Danann territory, and the old beliefs that people were still very, and in fact are still alive today in Ireland, never mind a millennium and a half ago. He's also, in a slightly different direction, he's got eyes towards Tara, the seat, absolute seat of political power in Ireland. A very, very clever individual. If I could just rewind a little bit to the question about the Book of Kildare, I did a quick Google search, and this is reliable information because it's Kildare Archaeological Society. They actually say that the book is lost. In other words, it doesn't exist anymore, the Book of Kildare. It's one of those books that they see mentioned in other manuscripts, but doesn't exist today. According to Geraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, very controversial figure because he was very derogatory, apparently, in his views about the Irish, suggested that when he visited Ireland over 800 years ago, that the book was in existence then, and the belief then was that it was written during the lifetime of the Virgin, which I presume refers to Brigid. So hopefully that answers the previous question as well.
Ah, excellent. Okay, thank you, Anthony. And Kathy mentions, sorry to backtrack, but for Anthony, I think the Vohart to Kildare route could possibly end in Ardmore. That is the site of St. Declan's Well. I'm definitely not sure, but the romantic in me hopes it does end there. Thanks for the fantastic presentation.
Well, I would just encourage anybody who lives or thinks they live along that route to search it themselves, because you see, my knowledge of this area is better. It could be that it passes through sites that I didn't see on the map. So I would absolutely encourage people to follow that route and see where it goes, because they'll probably strike gold somewhere along the line.
Thank you for that. Just another quick question, and then we'll probably close. But let's see. I had a question about. Let's see. Let's see. Thank you. Jane says, thank you also very much, particularly the sharing observations in comparison today of Miss Whalen. So moving and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
And let's see. Let's see. Okay. Jennifer mentions, just wanted to add that my eye turned to my own Irish ancestry through the indigenous individual as well. Okay. Let me just find one more, see if I can, or we'll just wrap. Well, it looks like we're about out of time. So, I want to, we'll end now. Let me just look one more time to see if there's any, we've got enough time. Oh, here's a question for Philomena. How were you introduced to the traditional Irish songs of Brigid? Your songs and stories were so beautiful. That's from Tonya.
Well, I grew up with those songs going to school, and that's where they come from. I just grew up in Ireland, and it was just in my family, in my school. When I went to school, you know, we learned the songs in the Irish language and in English, and just been there since then.
Yeah. That's lovely. That's lovely.
Yeah.
All right then. Thank you very much. And we'll bring this to a close. I'm sorry to say we're just about out of time. I want to thank all of our presenters for what they've given, and to each of you who took the time to join us today. A big thank you to Aideen Cleary, the behind the scenes technical assistant who has kept things running for us. Sessions of our St. Brigid Festival run through Sunday, February 7th. Please check out the Brigid Festival Vancouver website for the schedule and to learn more about our presenters today. Thank you for being here. May Brigid and the Celtic Spring stay long in our hearts. In closing, we offer a poem inspired by Brigid and commissioned by the Department of Foreign Affairs Ireland to mark our 2021 celebration today.
Oh, wow.
Thank you again.
This is Paula. Oh, Biddy, this is fabulous.
Have you no home to go to? The young mostly on one another's screens, but these two wrapped in each other at the boundary wall. That genetic imperative, the force that through the pandemic drives their flowering, is my spring rain, is my restorer from the deep delved wells, hauled to the healing light of this world. Pure water, tasting of gemstone and iron, quartzite and gold, starlight and planets, the sun and the comets, the moon herself, she sacred to Brigid, mirrored in my bucket. My own breath, old spirit, stirring in the cowled reflection of the earth geologic, old seas, old forests wherein once we swung. From tree to waterlogged tree become shale, become coal, underground tributaries to rivers of oil, breath lit fuel in their veins. They are fire, vestal and flame. They are immortal.